On January 15th, 1919, Boston was having a weirdly warm day. I mean, look, it was the dead of winter and it was 40 degrees. And you're like, oh my God, that's so cold. Because I was thinking that too. I was like, 40 degrees, that's freezing. I can't handle that. Just for comparison, the day before, it had only been 2 degrees. So on this day, it was 40 degrees. How did that happen? You know, it was a really big shift. 1919 was a really weird year. If you've been paying attention on dark history, it seems like all the weird shit happened in 1919. Point blank period. I just want to say that. Let it be known. Thank you. Put it on record. Okay, back to the story. While the people of Boston were enjoying the nice weather, because it's 40 degrees, they had no idea that this sunny day was about to cost them their lives. In the north end of Boston, there was like this big factory called the Purity Distilling Company. And I guess one of the things they were distilling there was molasses. Me personally, for the longest time, I thought molasses was like grass. It's not grass. Molasses is this thick, black, almost glue-like substance, and it stinks. But it can be like made from sugar cane or sugar beets, and it's usually used to sweeten and flavor foods. So over at Purity Distilling, they had a massive tank of molasses. And when I say massive, I'm not kidding. I mean, this bitch could hold over 2.5 million gallons of molasses. Now, allegedly, this tank had been leaking for some time. Now, this was not ideal. And I guess Purity Distillery employees had pointed this out to the higher-ups on multiple occasions because it was considered a hazard. So instead of fixing the leak, the owners came up with a brilliant idea. They decided to just paint the tank the same color as the molasses leaking out of it to camouflage it. No one can tell it's leaking now because it's all the same color. We did it, you guys. Yeah. This is like when a landlord just paints over all the mold you've been complaining about for weeks. And they're like, what mold? We got rid of it. Anyway, the tank was painted, but the leak was never fixed. I mean, so much so to the point where it became known that local kids would come collect the free molasses from the edges of the tank, fill her up. Oh yeah. But on that day in January, you did not want to be licking that tank or be anywhere near it. A batch of hot molasses had recently been added to this big bin thing. And I guess the heat from this new batch, plus the rapid change in the weather, created a ton of pressure within the tank, okay? Pressure. And it's not good. Now, because the structure was already leaky, it just could not handle what was going on. Inside the tank, the pressure is building and building and building, enough to cause an explosion. At 12:30 p.m., that's exactly what happened. The sound of the explosion was said to be deafening. So the metal from the tank and the rivets just explode into thousands of pieces of steel that just flew into the air like bullets at an insane speed, tearing straight through nearby buildings. One huge piece of the tank went flying into the railroad, causing the tracks to collapse. One family, the Lentoscas, were Italian immigrants living on Commercial Street, just down the road from Purity Distilling. Just before the disaster, Giuseppe was looking out of the second floor window while his son, Pasquale, who was 10 years old, he was outside collecting firewood, and he was doing so right next to the molasses tank. Whoa, I know. Now, it was hard to miss him because the little boy, he was wearing this super bright red sweater, and, so it was easy to spot him. He stood out. And again, it was just like a normal day. So Giuseppe's watching, whatever, and then just out of nowhere, Giuseppe kind of looks back at the window, and that's when he sees a huge tsunami wave of molasses coming at him. What? Yeah. I was thinking molasses wouldn't explode because it's so thick, dense, and glue-like. It's hard to imagine it exploding, but you have to believe me when I say the molasses literally turned into a huge tsunami wave and was, oh no, it was not good, okay? The molasses that exploded out of this tank created a tidal wave that was believed to have been 25 feet high and 165 feet wide. What? Huh? Yeah, that's big. That's real big. Since the molasses was warm and the pressure inside the tank was intense, it moved fast. The wave tore through the town, moving at 35 miles per hour, like freaking lava. Giuseppe saw the wave engulf his son, but it only took a couple of seconds before the wave reached the building that he was in. So it, comes through the building, whatever, and it knocks Giuseppe unconscious. Oh, fuck. Like, is that scary? Because molasses is so thick, it'd probably just like suffocate you. Oh my God. Giuseppe and his son, they weren't alone. The wave engulfed the north end of Boston. The local firehouse, which was right next to the distilling plant, was ripped right off of its foundation. And the whole building almost ended up in the nearby harbor. Other houses and buildings were destroyed, along with cars, wagons, and even freight cars. It tore down electrical wires and spilled into cellars, smothering any people that were inside. I'm telling you, this is a new nightmare that I did not need. I mean, molasses is so much heavier than water, so when it hit the town, it hit with an intense amount of force. And unlike an ocean wave, it didn't move in one direction. Instead, when the tank exploded, it went in every direction all at once. Oh no. Immediately, buildings were destroyed. Nothing had a chance. And you might be thinking, well, I would float on the surface. Nay. Instead of floating to the surface or being able to swim to safety, people were pulled under into the thick, hot syrup. Once the initial impact had ended, there was molasses waist deep on the street. Horses and people both became trapped in this sticky substance, sinking further into it the more they struggled. It was kind of acting like quicksand. Yeah. So rescue workers are out there just quickly pulling everyone they could from the molasses. Local firefighters and police were helped by sailors from the USS Nantucket, which was actually anchored at the nearby pier when the flood had happened. So they set up ladders across the molasses so rescuers could climb above the spill and pull people out. Super smart, right? When Giuseppe came to, his wife and his daughter were with him. He's like, oh my God, thank God. But his son, Pasquale, he was still missing. Giuseppe then spent the rest of his afternoon attempting to get past police barricades so he could just look and search for his son. He eventually returned home after being turned away from every entrance. Across town, a firefighter named George Leahy had become trapped in the firehouse. He was stuck in an 18-inch crawl space where he struggled to keep his head above the molasses. Now, after he was trapped there for 4 hours, and I was like, oh my God, was he saved? Tell me he was saved. He wasn't. He was trapped there for 4 hours and then later died. Hours later, just before dark, the rescue workers had found Pasquale. He had been thrown by the wave and crushed by a railroad car. He was killed instantly. Giuseppe was able to positively identify the remains of his son because of the red sweater the boy was wearing and still wearing. The rescue efforts lasted for 4 days. In the end, 21 people were killed in the Boston molasses flood. Pasquale's family was awarded $6,000, and George's family was given $7,000 for the pain and suffering he experienced before his death. I know. It's not funny, but I was like, he died, but he got $7,000. Well, his family did, but it's and $6,000 for Pasquale's family. Thanks. Obviously, it's not enough, is what I'm saying. Well, the town, they needed answers. They were like, what the fuck, right? Everyone wanted to know, how in the hell did this happen? But just like with the humbug poisoning, the culprit wasn't one specific person. Instead, it was a long list of incompetence. They had realized that the man who supervised the construction of the tank had completely lacked the necessary training for the job. No other engineers or experts had been hired to oversee the building of the tank. And the man they had, he didn't even know how to read blueprints. He's like, no, that looks good. The owners of the Purity Distilling Company quickly looked to shift the blame away from themselves, as companies do. They started by trying to minimize the suffering of all the people who had died as the result of a spill. They had these doctors, come forward and testify during a trial and say that the people who were suffocated by molasses were killed so quickly they did not have a chance to suffer, which, turns out, is not true. I don't think any of us need to be a doctor to know that suffocating in molasses is not really an ideal way to go. But the company, they didn't stop there. They also tried to avoid blame for the death of Pasquale. Both he and another child, Maria D'Estacio, had been collecting firewood near the tank when it exploded. Sadly, both of them had died, and the company claimed that since they were collecting firewood, they were technically trespassing. Yeah, they were trespassing on the company's property, so, boo. And if the two children were trespassers, the company was not under any obligation to keep them safe, so their families should not receive any compensation for the death of their children. Yeah, they really thought they were onto something. They also claimed that the explosion had nothing to do with the piss-poor construction of the tank, and instead they blamed terrorists. Yeah. They basically said the tank was sabotaged, even mentioning a bomb threat against the tank. The trial proved that was as ridiculous as you think it is. I mean, yes, I guess there had been other bombings in Boston that year, because again, 1919 was a fucking crazy year. But are terrorists really circling the molasses tanks as a high-profile target? It didn't make sense. The court case, it went on for over 5 years, but thank God eventually, proving the company was at fault. Thank you, hold them accountable. Structural failure caused the explosion, and the company was forced to pay restitution, which would equal about $15 million today. This case established that companies can be held accountable for disasters like this. I'm rolling my eyes if you can't see me, because it's is it true? If you try and do that today, they always fucking get out of it, don't they? But I digress. New laws and regulations were introduced, meaning that a certified architect or engineer would be required to sign off on building plans. Whoa, what an idea. This began in Boston and eventually became a requirement across the United States. So yes, sweets can kill people in wild and unexpected ways. Or at least they used to. The humbug poisoning took place in the 1850s, and the molasses spill was in 1919. Both led to laws changing to help protect people, right? And you're like, well, yeah, sadly, but finally, yeah, overdone. This should never happen again. And if it does, you kind of think it would be an old story. Pause your brain, because no, this is not just something that happened in the 1900s or 1880, whatever the hell the dates were. Because today, disasters involving sweets are still somehow destroying lives.